I always wanted to be a teacher when I started school.
We're here for the students and we want what's best for the student.
And I love watching people learn.
Be a teacher, student, academics, curriculum, whatever. That center post, the one that keeps this education together.
Hello, and welcome to the Last Best Learning Podcast, a podcast designed for Montana's educators, where our mission is to deliver digestible and relevant professional learning that honors educators' capacity in an increasingly busy world. Our state's educators empower minds, elevate futures, and inspire self-discovery, and we walk beside them. Your hosts today are Michelle McCarthy, Katrina Ingeldrum, and Claire Michelson, OPI's Science, Math, and ELA coordinators, respectively. We recently concluded a book study on the book Your Students, My Students, Our Students, Rethinking Equitable and Inclusive Classrooms, authored by Leanne Young, Nancy Frey, Douglas Fisher, and Julie Kroner. As part of our efforts to deepen our understanding of the material, we reached out to the authors to solicit their insights, and we were delighted to receive positive responses. While all of them expressed interest in participating, Dr. Douglas Fisher and Dr. Nancy Frey were able to schedule with us. We are thrilled to share this interview with our listeners. So I just wanted to say that we're so honored to have you both on the podcast. You both have done so much for education. I'm going to ask if you could share with us a little bit about your journeys, what first inspired your deep commitment to ensuring that all students are supported and valued in the classroom. Nancy, can you start us off?
Sure. I started off as a young mother who had students in school. My children were in school, and I was ready for a job, and I found a job as an aide, a paraprofessional in a segregated school for students with disabilities, and loved the work, loved working with families and working with kids. But what really struck me was the day that we took our children to the town that we lived in for a walk. We were going to be buying things, and people crossed the street to avoid us when they saw us coming. And it broke my heart. And I said to myself, there has to be a better way to be able to do it. And so that's what really sparked my interest in working with people with disabilities in inclusive settings.
Thank you for sharing it. Doug, what prompted you?
My mother was a library assistant at my elementary school. My stepmother was a fourth grade teacher for 35 years before she retired. So education has always been around me. I went out to school to become a speech therapist. I really didn't like that very much. I felt too isolated. And so I got a long-term sub job. Really liked it. Kept going back to school more and more. I, at one point, was teaching health, which every kid took. And so I had all these kids with all kinds of different learning needs in a class together, and no background, no training other than speech, and decided I needed to go back to school and learn more. And, my colleagues couldn't really talk to me about this, because if you were teaching English or biology or whatever, all those kids were other places. But in health, they all took the class. There were a couple of teachers who had all the kids, but very few.
Very different stories, but they're really good. So over the years, the idea of meeting diverse student needs has been approached in different ways. How do you define education that supports every learner? And how have these definitions evolved based on research?
Sure. I think when we think, so we have systems in place in schools, and we're trying to meet lots of students' needs. And at one point, the idea was, let's take out kids with different kinds of labels and put them with kids who have similar kinds of labels and see if that makes a difference. We tried that for a while. Then we tried a whole bunch of other things. And as evidence has been collected, people are making the best decisions they can with the evidence they have right now. I mean, at one point in our world's history, students with more significant disabilities didn't even go to school at all. And so, we have to be thinking about, at the time, what's the best evidence we have? And then we look back and say, we know more, and we have to do better. I am at a place in my career, my life, that I believe kids with all kinds of different learning needs need to be educated with their peers. And we have to build strong systems and support classroom teachers to meet those needs. One of the challenges, I think, that we see is that regular classroom teachers don't know what it means for success. How will this learner experience success? And if we only define success as meeting the grade level curriculum expectations, then teachers start to feel like failures. And so we have to help them think about what, based on this student's learning profile, some people even call it the jagged profile, that we have all these ranges of skills that are kind of jagged, which is an interesting way to think about the world. Based on this learner's profile, what will success look like right now, this week, this month, this semester? And if we help general ed teachers come up with that, and like right now, here's what this kid, we have a student who uses visual communication, like looking at a tray with pictures, images on it. And we're talking about making choices, yes, no. That is one level of success for this learner. And in a classroom, you can practice that many, many, many times. I also am intrigued, I'll let Nancy talk in just a second, I'm intrigued with the idea of the least dangerous assumption. And the least dangerous assumption we can make is that the kid is learning, growing, and developing. The most dangerous assumption we could make is the kid doesn't belong in this class and the kid's not getting any benefit from the class. Because we can't actually climb inside their minds and figure it out. So we go with the least dangerous assumption, is that they are benefiting academically and socially from this experience.
We can back that up with the research as well. Years ago, Chris Clear was one of the first people to be able to show what it was that children with Down syndrome could do in terms of reading if, in fact, they were taught how to read. Now, isn't that an interesting idea? It's really hard to get good at what you've never been taught how to do. And his findings were revolutionary and have been demonstrated again and again. There's a strong correlation between math outcomes and reading outcomes for students with disabilities who are educated in general education classrooms. And you know why? Because they get taught those kinds of things. Having access to that curriculum is an essential part of what it is that all children are able to do, including kids with paperwork.
Mute button got me. Thank you, Nancy. You're mentioning some research. And I'm wondering, we have a lot of schools and teachers within the schools that wrestle with the idea of classrooms that can fully support, just the variety of students we have in those rooms. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through some of the strongest research findings that highlight why those heterogeneous classrooms are designed to engage every student and how those benefit the entire learning community.
Much of the research around that, it applies to both students with and without disabilities. Being able to create a classroom community, a climate of learning is absolutely foundational for all students. And so how is it that we make sure that we're building community within the classroom? There's this idea that was pioneered by others around this helping curriculum that we set into place in our classroom, a helping curriculum where every student every day has the opportunity to offer help, to ask for help, to be able to provide help to somebody else, and to politely decline help when they're ready to persist for a bit longer. Creating a classroom community where there is that kind of helping curriculum is foundational. And then moving up from there, and again, we can draw on the research findings around this. What are the expectations of the teacher? What are those high expectations? And it's more than just having a coffee cup sentimentality that I believe all kids can learn, right? It's actually one of the strongest effect sizes in John Hattie's visible learning database around expectations for students, and that they come from the teacher and that they are demonstrated by the teacher, especially in terms of how it is that we build for success, how it is that we group students, how it is that we create those opportunities for students to be able to engage with the general education curriculum and with their classroom peers.
I'll add a couple, because I love that Nancy started with teacher expectations, because if I believe that kid can learn, I'm probably going to have a profound influence on that kid. If I don't believe that kid can learn, the reverse is true. In fact, we are spectacularly effective at getting our low expectations. But I'll highlight a few other areas. Labeling students, there have been studies where similar students are either labeled or not labeled, and they study the outcomes. The effect sizes are very significant. Telling educators, this kid has this label, changes expectations. And we can point to lots of studies. You can go to visiblelearningmetax.com, for example, and look at all the studies about labeling students. That carrying that label tends to lower those expectations. We can also look at the studies that have directly compared regular class placement with special class placement. And the range of studies are pretty significant. I mean, if you look at the meta-analyses that have been done on this, if you total them up, there's over 4.8 million kids in the various meta-analyses on inclusion and mainstreaming. And there are some with very high effects and some with moderate effects. And the average is pretty strong, about 0.32. And there are detractors, and there are always people who are like, you don't know this one kid. And so people always take the one kid out there and hold that one kid. So we put 10% or so of the student population in segregated settings because in our mind we have this one kid. When we move into confirmation bias, we start to look for things that we already expect. We start to say, this is a student who has this label, this disability, this learning need, so therefore this is what has to happen for that kid. And we confirm that for ourselves. And the part of the labeling research is when you don't tell people what the label is, they tend to say, I guess this kid's going to learn, and there's some, idiosyncratic behavior, but I guess this kid, there's no paperwork that comes with this kid. So I think we have to really analyze all of that, including our own biases, because when we hear disability, when we hear expectations, we change how we think about it.
And speaking of those expectations, I wonder if you can talk about some other misconceptions you see a lot happening in classrooms where teachers are supporting all students.
So I'll start out with that. I think one of the misconceptions that can happen is a misconception, a narrowing of the idea that it is only the academic profile that matters, without understanding that we're actually educating the whole child. And again, whether that child has paperwork or not, that's actually what it is that we're doing. So we're also looking for how it is that we're advancing that young person's language, their social abilities, their abilities to be able to work with one another. These are sometimes referred to as employability skills, right? How is it that you work with a range of people? And what can happen, a misconception that can happen, is that sometimes when we're talking about a student with a disability, the teacher may kind of narrow the focus and say, well, I need to make progress in those academic measures without appreciating the full developmental range of what it is that happens with students. And so being able to kind of widen that span and understand that is really important. I think it's interesting what it is that New Zealand does. New Zealand is one of the relatively few education systems in the world where students are they're moved by level as opposed to just chronological age. And very much the expectation is for any student that you're working with that you move them at least one level within 2 years. And that leveling system is broadened so that teachers can see what their progress is. Rather than comparing child A with child B, instead it's all about progress. How is it that we're advancing this young person's progress, which is going to look different than the person who is sitting next to them, because we're all individuals in that regard. There's a mindset there that sometimes gets narrowed into, oh, we're only talking about the test scores on the state test that are administered at the end of every school year.
Doug, anything to add?
I think she synthesized and summarized that pretty well.
Well, thanks, Doug.
So you sort of just gave an example of this, Nancy, but you've worked closely with, and Doug as well, with many schools that have transformed their classrooms to really meet the needs of all students, including at your own school in San Diego. Could you, and we'll start out with you again, Nancy, could you share an example where this transformation has been done particularly well?
I'll start with talking about the school where Doug and I are. We've been there now for 18 years. And as Doug noted earlier, it's all about the systems that you put into place. There is strong evidence that the relative sophistication of the system that a student is in is predictive of how much access that child will have to general education. It's not actually the disability label. It's the sophistication of the system. And so thinking through what systems look like can be absolutely essential to do so. So for example, maintaining segregated settings in schools rather, takes a certain number of adults and limits the contact that they have, because now they have to be in that self-contained classroom. How can we create systems where we're able to take those talented special educators and move them out into the full school so that they have opportunities to be able to really contribute to the overall advancement of all of the students in the school? This idea of collective responsibility is essential in this regard. And collective responsibility has been demonstrated as being predictive about whether schools will achieve their initiatives, especially around reading and around mathematics. Collective responsibility is when the entire school community views all of the students in the school as their students, not just the students that are on their own roster. And when we start to break down some of those walls that separate talented educators, general education and special education teachers, we start to erode what would otherwise be a really powerful system for being able to advance the learning of all students around collective responsibility. As we've noted in some of the other work that we've done, when you create systems that segregate students such that I see them only as my students, or I see them only as your students, we begin to chip away at all of that. Collective responsibility leads to collective teacher efficacy, which again is another one of those strong influences on the ability to be able to advance the academic learning, the academic achievement of all students.
I really appreciate you mentioning that that idea of collective responsibility with so many staff, because that is one emphasis that we really noticed across the book study when we were reading Your Students, My Students, Our Students. Just that role of everyone coming together, which we think about in theory, that's great, and but we don't always see it. So what do you think school leaders can do to really foster that strong collaborative culture and that collective responsibility among all of these different stakeholders within education?
Well, one thing that has to happen is that adults have to have regular opportunities to talk with one another. Certainly over the years, I've been exposed to systems where, for example, special educators are rarely invited to the same professional learning that their general education colleagues are invited to, and vice versa. We don't spend time with that professional learning and coaching and so on with general education teachers on some of those more specific technical aspects of special education. I am not in any way suggesting that everybody has to become an expert on everything. We do need to be able to foster a level of expertise among educators. However, when we've got systems in place that begin to separate out the learning that happens within a school, we start to erode that collective responsibility. And we do reinforce that idea that those are your kids and those are your kids, and we're not going to really come together for that. So at the leadership level, it's really important, for instance, that you make sure that there are there's opportunities to be able to engage with one another through your professional learning communities, for example. In many cases, professional learning communities are limited to a certain grade level. Doug calls them marriages of convenience. And the special educator is not even present in any of, as a part of that professional learning community team. So being able to create these opportunities for adults to be able to work together is key in order to be able to make sure that students are able to work together.
Thank you. Doug, do you have anything to add about that? I had just asked Nancy about what school leaders can do to really foster that collaboration and collective responsibility among educators.
And I appreciate her saying that you don't have to only limit to grade level or department. I think that's one of the things we can do. I was listening to this set of research, a podcast, and they were talking about the weak ties and the strong ties. And so we, as our teams, we have strong ties. Like I'm connected to certain people that I see a lot. But our general well-being and sense of efficacy is also influenced by the weak ties. And leaders can move people around to have people sit with other people. We can recognize successes. There's things we can do to foster the weak ties in our organizations. I think that's an interesting thing that we all should be learning more about. Are these, how do you maintain the strong ties, your team, and then how do you build the weak ties so people like their organizations? I'll also say that Nancy talked about collective responsibility, collective efficacy, and we've become pretty enamored with this idea of collective effervescence and this idea from Durkheim, 1912, around the joy that people get when they work together towards a shared goal. And so Nancy and I have been talking about maybe it goes from collective responsibility. This team, we are responsible for all these kids, like she was saying. And then we get evidence and data that we're making a difference. We move from responsibility to efficacy. But then some teams say, I really like this. We feel amazing. I really enjoy being in the adults. I don't make doctor's appointments to get out of my team meetings. I literally, that time is sacred for me. And that moves us to collective effervescence. And I think leaders have to be on the lookout. Where do I see teams that are only at collective responsibility? Where do I see teams that are moving into more collective efficacy? And then how do I support those teams to get joy from the experience? The narrative in most school systems right now is negative. There's turnover, there's this. We pay so much attention to the deficits right now. And we got to get past that. I'm not in denial that there aren't realities around attendance and student engagement and teacher shortages. I get that. But if that's all we talk about, we move in this deficit mindset and we will never have collective effervescence with our teams. Right.
That applies to everything, not just school, right?
Right.
Great point. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, Doug, But can you think of some simple, high-impact strategies that teachers could implement, say, tomorrow to better support all students without feeling overwhelmed?
Teacher modeling comes to mind. I think we see a decrease in teachers opening up their brains and explaining their own thinking. And Nancy and I have studied this from the perspective of kids who are very academically talented, and we've studied this from the perspective of kids who've experienced struggle with school. I think that's something we can return to. Many of us more veteran teachers, we did teacher modeling. We just don't see it as much. I think there's an anti-teacher talk mindset, and I hope teacher modeling doesn't go on for 30 minutes. But I think we've gone too far, and like teachers aren't supposed to talk at all. Well, you know something. You have expertise. Explain your thinking. It doesn't have to happen at the beginning. You don't want to ruin a phenomenon. I know some of you worry about science and math, and you don't want to ruin the phenomenon. But at some point, let's hear your thinking as an example, a worked example that young people can start to say, "Oh, I didn't think of it that way," or "I think it." Modeling comes to mind as an area of supporting learners. That's not taking away from anybody. It's moving that discourse to a new level in school. I think the other thing that's on my mind a lot these days, Nancy and I are working on a project on academic risk-taking, which is an old concept that kind of fell out of favor, but is really popular in higher ed right now, in especially undergraduate programs. Academic risk-taking, for example, which of the students raise their hand to ask questions? Which of the students volunteer information, ideas, concepts? Which students choose to do hard things? If you just took that in your class and said, of my class, so middle school, high school people think of second period, unless you're on prep, then go to third period. Elementary, 10 o'clock in the morning. How many kids engage in those kinds of behaviors? When I ask educators this, it's usually on one hand the number of kids who do this. We have to make it safe for young people to take risks. We have to recognize that in every content area they have some backgrounds of failing things, and we tell them, oh, failure, you learn from failure. We prefer to learn from success. And the optimal learning research says we have to be successful about 85% of the time, or the narrative becomes, I will experience failure again. So I think teachers need to increase students' opportunities for success. I think they need to be thinking about who in my class has academic risk-taking and who could have academic risk-taking. What kinds of things can I do to foster that and grow that with students? Because I want a class where everybody's choosing hard things for them. Everyone's saying, like, I have an idea, and they're not going to be shamed, embarrassed, humiliated. And they have like, oh, I want to put this out there. And it's like, oh, we're having a conversation and taking on these ideas.
I'll build on what it is that Doug just offered. What he's referring to is what's called the remembered success effect. And this may be of interest in particular around math. Specifically, and there was some really interesting work that was done with third graders and sixth graders in math, and they had two treatment groups, one business as usual, the other, the teachers were trained around remembered success. And what they did is they restructured their classroom assignments. You know, many of us will have must-dos and may-dos, right? Here are the things that you must do, and then if you choose, you could also do these more challenge activities. And so what these teachers were taught how to do is to be able to recreate their math assignments such that the first couple of items drew on things that students already knew. In other words, that they were kind of doing a bit of a review of some past skills or concepts. The bulk of the assignment were those newer learnings, that more challenging work that they were doing, and then they finished the math assignment with one or two items that again drew on past learning that students were already able to do. What they were really paying attention to were how many kids would choose to do the may do. In other words, you know, it's an extension, it's not something I have to do. And what they found was a significantly different response from students in the remembered success classrooms in being able to choose to do that more challenging may-do kind of assignment. And you know why? Because they remembered their success. that they had just had. As Doug noted, you can learn from failure, but we definitely prefer to learn from success. That's something that teachers can restructure for their students this week.
Many educators want to improve how they support diverse learners, but don't always know where to start. What professional development approaches have you found to be most effective in helping schools take these first steps?
A lot of the professional learning can actually happen through coaching, through learning walks. It's not only what it is that we're doing on Wednesday afternoons, right? That is a piece of it, but it is certainly not everything that has to do with professional learning. So how, for example, do instructional coaches, mentors in grade levels engage with their colleagues in being able to kind of build that knowledge? General educators and special educators, as one example, are able to build the knowledge of one another, but we have to give them opportunities to be able to have contact with one another. Another powerful way to be able to do so is through learning walks. And learning walks are not evaluative. They are opportunities for a team of teachers to be able to spend time in their colleagues' classrooms together with a focus on a particular item that they are paying lots of attention to. Most teachers in most polls will tell you that they wish that they had more opportunities to be able to spend time in each other's classrooms. That's a great way to be able to spread innovation. And at the leadership level, restructuring what those opportunities look like to be able to engage in learning walks, to be able to ensure that there are protocols for instructional coaches, for mentors, for grade level chairs, and so on, to be able to engage with conversation with one another can really help to build up that professional learning, not only through those standalone opportunities.
I like that we can learn from each other. Doug, did you want to add anything?
I think so. I appreciate Nancy's comments about collaboration and connecting with your colleagues. I think I'll go back to success, because grown-ups want to be successful like our students want to be successful, and defining what it means to be successful. And we have very long-term outcome kinds of successes like raising test scores and things like that. And that's not unimportant, but what's the more proximal success? So a kid who has challenging behavior in class, well, how can we help that teacher redefine what success will look like? So that teacher says, oh, I am successful. I feel good about this. When I leave work today, the narrative in my mind was, this worked. I feel successful. So I think helping redefine success, defining success, collecting evidence of success, and I think people like coaches and peers and leaders need to make the clear connection between effort and impact. When you did this, here are the great things that happened. And we need to reconnect that for people to say, you're doing great things. Good things are happening.
I like that. I had to write it down, from effort to impact.
In Montana, we are adopting new content standards. Currently in math, ELA is coming up, English language proficiency, so it seems like a lot all at once. Do you have any advice? And this is sort of a self-interested question for us to kind of take your expertise into our schools. But do you have any advice for schools that are trying to align these new standards with approaches that are going to help support every student, especially in ways that involve that collective responsibility and efficacy?
And I think that is one of the challenges in looking at content standards versus what is it that you want the adults to do. And so, as you know, the content standards are articulating what it is that we want our students to be able to learn. But what underpins those content standards is how it is that adults work together in order to be able to move that. So importantly, I think what the apparatus that goes alongside of those content standards is essential. How is it, for example, that we're able to measure progress by something more sophisticated than just the annual test that happens at the end of the year. So how do we do progress monitoring, for example, so that we can feed into and feed that collective responsibility and collective efficacy and collective effervescence of the teams that are working to do so. Progress monitoring, I think, is an essential part of what it is that needs to go underneath those content standards.
Doug, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think progress monitoring, people, how do I say this right? Progress monitoring is not a bad thing. And people are like, oh, we have to collect all this assessment information, and it's how we teach. It's the link between teaching and learning. It feeds our efficacy souls, so I think we have to be really careful about how we talk about the evidence we collect from students, and it's not one more thing and the burden of assessment and all this. It's the evidence that we're trying to generate to make instructional decisions and to look at impact. We should not be afraid of that. We should not say we're wasting instructional minutes by having assessment time. The thing I was thinking about as Nancy was talking was our work on teacher clarity. We've done a lot of work on clarity and strongly believe that students deserve to know what they're learning and what successful learning looks like, because that helps them take responsibility. That helps the teacher design the learning experiences, whatever the flow of the organization of the lesson. And I had someone say to me recently, I just want to teach, on this teacher clarity, like at a workshop, I just want to teach. And I said to this person, teach what and how? Isn't that the whole basis of clarity? What are you teaching? Do your students know that? And how are you going to use your minutes? How are you going to line up the minutes to accomplish what you want them to learn? This is not rocket science. But for someone to say, I don't want to focus on teacher clarity, I just want to teach, means they really don't understand the power of inviting students into the process and saying, here's what we're learning. Here's what successful learning looks like. Here's how I'm going to design the experiences to get you there.
Thank you. I went to the teacher clarity training in Missoula here in December. So I've been doing mini PDs for Katrina and Michelle and some of our other team members. But it's really a great way to kind of remind yourself, like, you're communicating with the students and you're also kind of clarifying what you're doing. So I appreciate you connecting to that.
Well, and I was just going to add to what Doug was offering too, in terms of the content standards themselves. I think that, if I could wave a magic wand, in particular, I think that some of the apparatus that can be developed alongside of those content standards is, for example, the state being able to do some learning progressions. So what are some of those learning progressions? Because those content standards are written as outcomes. They're not, if it's a second grade standard, it's not like we're expecting that the kids are going to be able to hit that the second week of school, right? It's going to take the entire school year to be able to do that. I think it could be of a tremendous service to Montana educators to be able to develop alongside of that, what are some of the major learning progressions that should happen within those standards so that it equips teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals. It equips all of them with the ability to more closely do that progress monitoring, to be able to say, here's where it is that we're seeing students that are progressing. And when we don't see the kind of expected progress, we know that in November, we don't have to wait until the test in April or May.
Yeah, thank you. That's another one. We could have a whole nother podcast on asking too about learning progressions, but we'll stop ourselves. So as we look to the future of education, what do you see as sort of the next big step in improving how we do serve all learners? And we'll start with Nancy.
Oh, wow. I get to look into a crystal ball, huh?
Tell the future.
The next big step, I love the tone and the hopefulness and the optimism of that question as well. I think it's important first to note where it is that we have been and how far we have come. in my lifetime as a student, there was a time when people with disabilities were not even educated. That's changed significantly. As of the 2021 school year, I believe, 7 out of 8 students with disabilities spend at least some time in general education classrooms. That was not the case a couple of decades ago. And so we need to understand where the progress has been and how it is that we have gotten there so far in order to be able to inform what are the things that need to happen next in doing so. What I'd love to be able to see, especially, is that we create systems over time that allow for more flexibility, that are not only chronologically aged, that we're not housing students based on when their birthday was, but also that we have some more sophisticated systems so that we can say, here's where it is that you'll be for the next 2 or 3 years. And what we want to do is to be able to monitor your progress as we move through some important levels. Some people are going to move a little bit more quickly. Others are going to take a bit longer. But when we kind of move away just a bit from only chronological age grouping to understanding that we're looking for progress, not only mastery, but that we're looking for progress, I think that opens up the possibility and the talents of educators to be able to say, I got it. It's not just they need to go to the next grade level. I want to pay attention to the progress that they're making, the developmental progress that's happening.
Thank you. Doug, do you have anything to add to that?
Predicting the future. You got to stay general enough so that your predictions can stay pretty. Yeah, right. No, I'm teasing you on that. So I think there's a mindset that in education it's a pendulum and we rapidly swing back and forth. And Nancy and I have said over the years, don't really buy that analogy. I think of more like a drill where you're drilling deeper, and each time it comes around, we learn more and go deeper and deeper into this. I don't see it as a pendulum swinging wildly back and forth. I see us trying to understand how to support every kid who shows up. And we have times where there's a deeper learning, and then we have to move into implementation. And then we have to settle, and then we go into deeper learning. And I think those phases are really important as we think about it. The world knows a lot about how to support a range of kids. We have an implementation issue. That implementation issue is hindered by personal beliefs rather than fact, by traditions and systems from the past rather than fact. And I think if we could move to stronger implementation, like what will this take? Then we can determine the next generation of work that we have to do to really continue that support model. But we haven't implemented the evidence that we've collected. I mean, the world has the evidence, it hasn't been implemented yet. So to be able to say like, it doesn't work is probably not accurate.
I'll offer a further comment on that as well. As we think about future-proofing our students, right? Important to note, we are not preparing students for our past. We're preparing our students for their future. And that's an important idea to be able to keep in mind. So let's think about what their future is. 20% of the students that you have in your classroom today, statistically, are going to have a child with a disability. It might be a mild disability, it might be a more significant disability. How are we preparing those young people for what their future is going to be? Many of the students that are in our classes today are going to be themselves employers. They're going to be business owners. They're going to be colleagues, work colleagues. How are we preparing them for a future where people with disabilities and people without disabilities are able to work together, to live together, and to be able to be family together? So when we think about future-proofing, we need to get those young people ready for what their lives will look like, not just what our past has been.
That's a beautiful sentiment to wrap us up, Nancy.
We cannot thank you guys enough. Is there anything that you want to just say to the Montana teachers out there that we didn't address?
I would say you're making a difference, and hold on to that in your heart because those kids need you. Don't quit. You've got this. You're amazing. And someday those kids are going to come back and they're going to look at you and say, do you remember me? And you're going to be flooded with these memories of the kids whose lives you touched.
We're all in this profession for essentially 3 reasons, and they're sometimes referred to as the moral rewards of teaching. And the moral rewards of teaching are that we understand the beauty of the subjects that we teach, and we want to be able to share that. We want to stay immersed in what that content is. But it's also that we know how very important it is that we are in the company of young people. That's the second moral reward. And that third moral reward is that we get to invest in our communities, in many cases to be able to pay back our communities and to be able to pay it forward. And keeping in mind what those moral rewards are, why you became an educator, thank you so much for everything that all of you do. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you
both for joining us.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us. Our audience will significantly benefit from the research, insights, and examples that you have shared. We acknowledge that all students possess the capacity to learn, and they achieve even greater success when they are part of a peer-supported environment. For those of you who may be new to our series, we conclude each month with a quote that reflects the themes discussed in the episode. This month, we are pleased to present a quote from the book, Your Students, My Students, Our Students, Rethinking Equitable Inclusive Classrooms. Teachers' expectations become students' reality. And while you're at it, make sure to expect more of yourself as well. As you reflect on today's episode, we encourage you to consider the following questions. What immediate steps can you take to ensure your classroom supports the success and participation of all students? If your classroom already supports a wide range of learners, how might you further enhance their experience? The next question is, how might you benefit from fostering open communication with your students and collaborating with your school's special education director or support staff? If you'd like to dive deeper into these topics, check out our listener's guide, which includes a pathway for earning professional development units through collaborative learning. Please find the link in the description. Finally, if you have ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Please fill out the Qualtrics form linked in the bio and in the listener guide. Your input helps us continue to provide meaningful and timely content for Montana's educators. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep inspiring.